I've seen a lot of assumptions made around the monetary benefits. Everyone just assumes, oh, when we get beyond visual line of sight, the growth in the industry is going to hockey stick. I try to tell people
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 191. What did we learn in 2018 about where the drone industry is headed? For that question, we turn to Colin Snow, CEO and founder of Skylogic Research, also known as the Drone Analyst. Skylogic Research is a research, content, and advisory services firm providing research-based insights on commercial drone market segments. Its mission is to help companies make critical investment decisions with confidence. Colin is a 25-year technology industry veteran with a background in market research, enterprise software, electronics, digital imaging, and mobility. His experience includes aerial photography as well as making, programming, and piloting remote control aircraft. He holds an MBA from Florida Atlantic University, is a member of all UAS industry groups including both AUVSI and AMA, and also holds an FAA Part 107 remote pilot certification. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Colin talks about the forces that shaped the drone industry in 2018 and what we might expect in 2019. There's no better person from which to gain insights into the drone industry than Colin Snow. But before we hear from Colin, I want to thank those of you who have been supporting my funding campaign. Now you have the option of making a one-time donation in any amount by going to droneradioshow.com/donate. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the costs of production and keep the podcast going and growing. And if you want to make a monthly contribution, you can still do that at patreon.com/droneradioshow. So let's get a drone industry update with Colin Snow of Skylogic Research. In our conversation, I asked Colin to share his thoughts on the drone industry in 2018.
So 2018 was a really big year for commercial drone industry as a whole, and it saw a significant increase in business adoption and the expansion of the FAA's LANCE program. That's the low altitude authorization and notification capability that provides access to controlled airspace near airports. We saw the launch of the UAS integration pilot program from the FAA, that's known as the IPP. We saw new products from DJI like their Phantom 4 RTK. We saw some significant develops for new regulatory framework for drones in Europe and in India. However, if I was to distill the year down to, say, three key forces, I would say the three key forces that really shaped the industry this past year was business adoption, vendor contraction and expansion, and then something that I call the DJI Effect.
Let's start with business adoption. How is business adoption evolving and shaping the industry?
Adoption wasn't widespread, but it did grow in select industries such as insurance, utilities, construction, and surveying engineering. So last year, we saw companies begin to move to the provisional use of drones where they were outsourcing to determine the feasibility of drone programs. To now in 2018, we saw them begin to stand up or expand their internal teams to manage workflow and the data. And you can see this trend particularly in the US when you look at the number of certified Part 107 remote pilots. We track this number every month. The FAA releases the numbers. And in the US, began the year with about 74,000 certified remote pilots. And as of the end of November, we had about 112,000. So we've added over 38,000 pilots this year. That's a 50% increase. The thing about this increase is that it's mostly pilots who work for companies, enterprises, or public agencies that have internal programs. And we saw this from the data from our annual benchmark survey, which we did over the summer. And this is our third annual industry benchmark report. And the objective of that research is each year we kind of want to gain insights on the industry players, who's thriving, who's not, how businesses are using drones to acquire data and what are they doing in the day-to-day operations. And we look at 4 distinct segments of the market. We look at drone aircraft and payload. We look at service providers. We look at business and public agency users. And then we look at the software apps and services. And the data we collect on this report comes from a survey that we do over the web. We did it this past year in July and August. And the research is sponsored. So we did have sponsors. We had sponsors of DJI and Drone Deploy and Drone Insurance and Trimble. But there's no input from the sponsors allowed during the survey execution or analysis. So it's an independent survey. And we had over 2,500 respondents. So we got a very, very good sampling of the market. We found people came in from 60 industries worldwide. We created this pretty large report that analyzes all the data. It's over 100 pages, but it contains 10 key insights about the current state of the industry. And again, this is one of the things we found was that business adoption is plodding along slowly. That was one of our key insights.
The second major force is vendor contraction and consolidation. What were some of the big stories in this area?
Probably the biggest contraction story was around Airware. It was a massive failure, $118 million invested into the company. And it serves sort of as a cautionary tale for all potential commercial drone investors, as well as existing commercial drone market participants. I wrote about this just after it happened. Fortunately, Del Air acquired Airware's software solution, which is good because that ensures continuity of service for existing customers and dealers. As part of the agreement, Del Air also kept the team from construction and mining that were specialists as part of the Redbird acquisition, which Airware bought back in 2016. The good news here is that the combination of Del Air and Airware's assets and their team really offers a good variety of service across a wide range of industries. And we really liked the Redbird software in particular. We thought that's a really good piece of software. So we're glad to see that out of the ashes came a little bit of a resurrection. We'll see what happens with Del Air in the future. Sort of the lesson learned here is that Airware made several pivots from hardware platform to a solution provider focused on insurance, and then to the Redbird, like I said, the Redbird acquisition. But for the most part, they succumbed to the DJI effect, and I can talk about that more later. Going back to other vendor contractions and expansions, probably the biggest contraction story, second to that, was Parrot's announcement. The CEO announced just last month kind of disappointing financial results because of what he called significant consumer drone market contraction. That isn't really true. I can come back and talk more about that. Suffice to say, they're running on thin cash flow, and it'll be interesting to see if there's any right sizing of Parrot's and its affiliates. Those are the companies that Parrot's invested in, SenseFly and Pix4D, in 2019. Another big move that we saw, Randy, last year was with Precision Hawk, who acquired 2 companies to speak of, Hazon and Inspect Tools. These are businesses that specialized in inspection services and technology for the energy sector. And they bring Precision Hawk some domain expertise that will enable some pretty tighter integration between the collection of the data and the analysis of the drone data. And that's something that customers want. Hazon in particular brings an extensive aviation experience and standard-based operating procedures, certified flight operations, inspection services. And they're pretty widely regarded as the best in the energy industry. Inspect Tools, on the other hand, that's the other acquisition. They really have sort of this high-fidelity machine vision software and data analysis tools for the renewable energy market. So their software is used in solar panel and wind turbine inspections, and it's used by some of the largest equipment manufacturers and service providers in the world, customers like Vestas and PG&E and SMA Solar. They all use Inspect Tools, reporting and analytics and machine learning. The bottom line is we think that these acquisitions are position Precision Hawk as a leading service provider for a company who wants to perform asset inspections, specifically those companies in the oil and gas and insurance and utilities industries, and those who want to do beyond visual line of sight operations. If you recall, Precision Hawk was part of the FAA's Pathfinder program. So they have extensive experience now in beyond visual line of sight operations, not just themselves, but also with Hazon.
Now, the third force that you mentioned is the DJI Effect. What is it, and how does it impact the drone industry?
So let me go back a little bit to the Parrot story and talk about 2 things we found in our research. And this is where I want to clarify what I said about Parrot. The professional use of consumer drones was growing the previous year, but especially again last year. So we didn't see any contraction, but we did see a shift in the use of consumer drones. In other words, more consumer drones are being used for professional purposes. Our data from our survey shows that almost 3/4 of all drones weighing over 250 grams are purchased for professional purposes. And I say over 250 grams because that's the cutoff line for when you're required to register a drone in the US. So those drones are being used for professional purposes or government purposes. That means 75%, so 3/4 of all drones weighing over 250 grams are used for professional purposes. And that's up from last year. And part of that is because of the increasing amount of technology that DJI is putting into their consumer drones. They're simply good enough for business use. So, DJI continues to dominate the market, and this is the DJI Effect. They've made gains in every category from drone aircraft sales at all price ranges to add-on payloads to software. We showed DJI being the dominant brand for aircraft purchases. They've got a 74% global market share across all price points. It's even higher in some of the key price points like the $1,000 to $2,000 range, which is the range where most people buy. DJI's current market share, like I said, 74%. That's up from 72% in 2017 and up from 2016 where it was somewhere around 50%. Kind of one note I make when I talk about the DJI effect is that many UAS and news pundits and industry specialists, they speculated in late 2017 and early 2018 that the security concerns that came out about DJI and the potential of data going back to servers in China would be the death knell of DJI because they're a Chinese-based company. But from where we sit, clearly these concerns didn't affect sales, and talking to them personally, that it didn't affect their sales that much. And so one of the things that DJI did was to stem the concerns about their data security practices was they hired an outside forensic investigation company called Kivu Consulting to independently review their data transmission and storage practices. And Kivu's analysis of DJI and the flight control systems and the hardware and the Go4 mobile app concluded that users have control over all types of the data that DJI drones collect, store, and transmit. So pretty much the rumors were quelled, at least, and they got an independent consultant to come in and look at it. Again, I kind of go back to the DJI effect. Their dominance really can be attributed to their aggressive product development, their technology advancements, and the partnerships they've developed in the enterprise channel. We noticed this early on. Back in 2015, we looked at FAA data on commercial drone registrations. They were the major manufacturer or brand that was being registered. Even today, the company continues to release new product after new product, and now they're starting to venture into the higher end of the market and into the higher price range above $7,500, where a lot of industrial users are looking for more durable equipment, easy to use, but durable equipment. And they simply just lead all the other manufacturers with technology and partnerships. From where we sit, we think that'll continue well into the future, given their current lead, their strategic partnership and investment with Hasselblad. They've got an R&D facility here in Palo Alto, California, and the continuation of their AirWorks conference. That's their enterprise partners ecosystem event.
So based on current trends, what might we expect in the drone industry for 2019?
Well, sort of more of the same. I hate to be dull here, but we think there'll be a lot of headlines and claims of victory like major customer wins and airspace integration and burrito deliveries. But we believe the reality is that there are going to be incremental growth in key segments of the market, as well as more mergers and acquisitions, especially as vendors to seek new revenue streams, or as their cash dries up. We think that there'll be more contraction. We also expect existing vendors will either look to get acquired or look to markets outside the U.S. to meet their forecast promises. We think that some of the smaller service providers, maybe even some of the smaller vendors, will just crater. It's funny, I'm starting to see predictions, though, that come from industry leaders, insiders, and most of them, they're painting this very rosy picture for next year. For example, I read one recently that where an insider predicts that 2019 will be the year of the autonomous drone. And so we'll see private companies and public agencies dispatch autonomous drones together with existing network fleets of ground and aerial vehicles for data gathering and yes, drone delivery. And these operators will be able to fly a drone from anywhere in the world with a network connected ground control stations, and data is going to be transmitted back via network connected ground control stations, or even, a connected drone. And public agencies are going to see these connected fleets of ambulance and fire trucks and helicopters and natural disaster response. And it just goes on, and they talk about, drones being integrated in smart cities as an essential part of the infrastructure, inspection and asset management. And, private companies are going to integrate them with cargo planes and freight trucks. And I could go on. And I agree, at some point we'll see some of that, but just not 2019. And I understand the need for some people to paint a rosy picture. For some vendors, it's important to keep up a good story because they need to keep their investors from pulling back on them. I live in Silicon Valley, Randy, and this is the narrative that it's not just inherent to drones. It goes across other industries and software and hardware, and from artificial intelligence to Hyperloop trains. There's a great title from an article I read about the promise of technology, and the title says it all. The future is just 2 years away, forever until you're dead. And I think that's it. The other prediction that people are making is on the regulatory front. For example, I saw one industry predict that the FAA will implement, a requirement for remote identification for all drones, recreational and commercial in the US. I think it's important to be clear here. For one thing, there's a big difference between the FAA proposing a rule, that's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, and that rule actually become law. The difference can be anywhere from 9 to 18 months. So arguably, you could say that, and the FAA said they want to come forth with the proposed rules, but the implementation is going to be longer off. But Randy, let me address now that hype, because I've heard an FAA representative speak just recently at the DJI Airworks conference, and he said this, drone ID is just not a slam dunk. And the specifics of ID signature is still debated within the FAA and other departments. So while it's true that drone ID needs to be there for the industry to go forward and be there for things like universal traffic management, which is UTM, which most see as the thing that's needed to enable these use cases where you've got package delivery or aerial taxi services. And I just don't think the first iteration of this is somehow going to mark a moment when UTM comes out of its cocoon and it becomes something that's actually happened that equals the headlines or the expectations that vendors have, and that somehow we're going to see this thing. And I see people drawing the connection between that and a global registry of pilots. I think that's wishful thinking, and I think it discounts the arduous political process that's needed in each country or region to make that possible.
Taking all of this into account, which industries are likely to emerge as winners and losers?
I don't think there's losers. I just think that there are industries where you're going to see larger growth than others. So we've been tracking this, like I said, for 3 years in our industry benchmark, but our research goes back all the way to 2014. This year and last year and the year before, we kind of looked at this two ways. First, we looked at what industries do the drone service providers operate in. And then second, we look at what industries do businesses and enterprise with drone programs operate. And we ask specific questions about their use cases, because what's more important than the industry is the actual use case. So let's start with the drone service providers. In our survey, we found that very few drone service providers make a lot of money, and actually only 12% make more than $100,000. That's more than last year, so that's good. So there's a little bit of movement for DSPs. And when we look at the top 10 drone services that are making over $100,000 a year, we ranked them this way. So number one, the drone service providers that are offering surveying, mapping, and GIS, they're at the top of the list. There's more of them making more money than any other. The second would be those DSPs that are helping with utilities, infrastructure, inspection, or monitor. Third would be aerial photography and video. And if you remember, aerial photography and video was the very first use case back when we were operating years ago under Section 333. The very first applicants were cinematography and aerial photography and video firms. Coming up on the list, construction, and then agriculture, and then consulting, and then education, cinematography and TV, data aggregation and analytics services, and then mining and aggregate. And that hasn't changed much, except as I mentioned, aerial photography and video is starting to get crowded out as more people are becoming more specialized. When we look at business and public agencies, we find the primary mission of their program, still the largest, is aerial photography and video. And that tells us that there's still a lot of companies in the provisional phases. They're just checking it out. The next largest category, that's 23%, by the way, 23% of companies who have drone programs, all they're really doing is aerial photography and video. The next 20% are doing surveying and mapping and GIS work. Another 7% after that are doing construction. Another 6% first responder service. And then agriculture is about 6% after that. And these percentages are very similar to last year, but there's a shift. As I think I mentioned this in the DSPs, there's a shift now to more complex use cases. And a lot of that has to do with the growing sophistication of drone payloads. It has to do with the maturity of the program. So programs that were started a year or 2 years ago are now becoming more sophisticated. They're taking on more use cases. And the drone payloads have gotten better and cheaper and more integrated. So most of those come from DJI and FLIR, and you have companies that are offering better integration with LiDAR. And post-production software to support those use cases is simply becoming more ubiquitous. For example, let me talk specifically about surveying, engineering, construction, and agriculture. We're seeing growth in that because mapping and image processing software with drones is a lot simpler than it was 2 or 3 years ago, or even a year ago. So you've got apps like 3D Robotic Site Scan, DJI Go, DJI GS Pro, you got Drone Deploy, you got Precision Hawk, you got Centauri, you got Skycatch, and others. They're all integrated with DJI drones. And so automated flight mission planning is much easier for using. And again, this is the DJI effect. It's not just the aircraft. It's the software that controls them. It's the third-party software. When DJI, a couple of years, say 3 years ago, announced their Inspire 1 aircraft. That's the one where the rotors come up and get out of the way of the camera, and it was kind of a cool-looking drone. It's kind of a unique design. The understated announcement at that launch was the launch of the DJI SDK, Software Development Kit. That's when companies began to get access to it, the software that runs the drone, so that they could create these third-party apps. DJI was very smart in doing that. They understood that to make the play faster, they were going to need to create an ecosystem and have third-party applications run their ships, but then do the post-processing. So that's part of that DJI effect. The other thing that happened last year, and we think will continue in 2019, is the focus on workflows and downstream data integration. The software vendors in this space, Randy, they really get it. And that's why you see vendors like 3D Robotics, DJI, Drone Deploy, Caspery, to name a few, expanding their app plugin ecosystems and making it easier for enterprise data integration into engineering and building information management systems like Autodesk and Bentley and Trimble, and GIS systems like Esri, and enterprise software like ERP, and enterprise management systems like IBM, Oracle, and SAP. We think that trend's going to continue, and the focus is going to be on that this year for the software firms. One thing that I think will change this next year is the improvement of the business case for beyond visual line of sight operations. And I don't mean drone delivery of consumer goods. I mean the industrial use of drones operating beyond visual line of sight. We've had the Pathfinder program for a while, and under the IPP program, that's the program that the FAA's got going around the country, the 10 sites that are doing the program, you're seeing operations for and testing of beyond visual line of sight. Up to now, I've seen a lot of assumptions made around the monetary benefits. Everyone just assumes, when we get beyond visual line of sight, the growth in the industry is going to hockey stick. I try to tell people we're going to be under Part 107 waiver requirement for a long time, maybe 10 years. If you look at the FAA's roadmap to when we're going to get beyond visual line of sight, that is specialized operations, it's a long way off, which means that businesses, if they want to do beyond visual line of sight mapping and inspection, they need to understand the economic efficiencies of beyond visual line of sight versus the current operation of visual line of sight. If they want to make the business case to their executive, they need to understand where the ROI is. We did a bit of research on the topic this year, and you should see a report in January detailing those benefits.
As we move into 2019, What questions or uncertainties remain that, if addressed, could dramatically affect the industry?
You may recall on last year's show, I said that the widespread adoption would take some time. That's true today. We think that's going to be true tomorrow. Business and industry adoption is growing, but it's mixed. And it's mixed because of factors that are outside of the control of drone vendors and drone software and service providers. It has to do with factors such as the digitization of industries. It varies by industry. So some industries are more digitized and they're more likely to adopt drones because drones are a digitizing technology. So it varies by industry. So the growth depends on how well that industry in general is digitized. Companies in general are risk averse. So that's a factor that's outside of a lot of people's control. And businesses are reluctant to share too much information about their successes. I've talked to industry insiders about this one for a while. They have customers, but their customers aren't coming forward and won't come forward for legal reasons, and they don't want to give their competitors a leg up. So they're reluctant to talk about the successes that they've had in using drones. And it's all across. It's everything from energy to agriculture to a lot of businesses are not going to talk about their use cases. And I think it's important because one of the things that actually spurs growth is people hearing other people's success stories. So those are non-technical challenges. And I think most of the challenges for the drone industry are not technical. For example, some of the biggest challenges are regulation. People have been talking about this from the beginning. One of the things that worries me, concerns me, is the FAA IPP program, their UAS integrated pilot program. As those local and state municipalities begin to make policies, we worry that there's going to be too much of a patchwork quilt of rules so that it makes it very difficult or impossible for companies to operate, to do things as simple as a use case that they can do now, work at a construction site. Because there's some piece of regulation that's preventing them from operating drones, from taking off or landing, or operating within a city, or they have to get a permit, or just, it's just the burden of regulation. And two, one of the things that people ask me about is, when are we going to see human transport, this urban air mobility? We're a bit of contrarian. We follow that not closely because we know it's a long way off. And, we think, sustainable flight and airspace integration, that's not a technical challenge as much as creating a safety case for the aircraft. We think that there's a challenge there. And we think that's still yet to be made to the FAA. We see it in other countries where people have got drone taxis and, urban air mobility. We just don't think that the FAA is going to be certifying drones for human transport in the near future. We also see challenges, Randy, in public sentiment. The basic public still has concern. Every survey we read, when the public is asked about their concerns about drones, it's about safety, it's about security, it's about privacy. It's also about public nuisance. Even the tests that are done in Australia for drone delivery, public nuisance came up as a big concern. So, one of the other challenges too is we see challenges in how business value is communicated. And I think the onus is on the drone vendors for this one. For example, we've yet to see credible return on investment of a drone use case that hits the executive scorecard. Executive scorecard is how the CEO, the CFO, and the executives and the investors run the company. They look at that scorecard to understand the implementation of their strategy and the success of their strategy. The key question that I ask is, what's the monetary benefit that drones have and the information is gleaned from them? What monetary benefit does that provide to shareholder value? I think when that story gets told, we'll see more movement forward in some of the more difficult and even some of the easy use cases where you've got a risk-averse company.
And for my final question, Colin, what can we look forward to in the short run?
We should see a proposed rule from the FAA that combines drone ID with flight over people. That's what the FAA is telling us. That's going to be open for public comment. It should come in 2019. We all need to read it. We need to read it carefully, and we need to provide the FAA feedback on what we see. And hopefully the requirements will be straightforward and the process to get it to law will be quick. I think that it'll help the industry move to the next level.
That's it for episode 191 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Colin Snow of Skylogic Research. I want to thank Colin for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about Skylogic Research or want to connect with Colin, check out the webpage at droneanalyst.com. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the costs of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate or patreon.com/droneradioshow. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.